Good afternoon and welcome to episode number 35 of At Your Service with Haber and Martinez. Today's show is entitled The Vernal Equinox, Divine Fairness versus Equality Under the Law. How did I come up with that name? Well, today is the Vernal Equinox. It is the spring equinox, and that means 2 times a year, spring and autumn, the Earth experiences an exactly equal proportion of daylight and sunlight. True equality, true fairness. The other 363 or 364 days of the year, we don't have that exact 50-50 split, and that's why there's only 2 equinoxes. That got us to thinking about fundamental fairness in terms of the criminal justice system, because 365 days out of the year, everybody should receive fundamental fairness. Justice is supposed to be blind. Anyone who's ever seen the Statue of Liberty knows Lady Liberty's eyes are blindfolded. And the scales of justice are supposed to be balanced equally, unless one side tilts the scale towards his or her advantage. And with that in mind, we decided to talk about different aspects of fairness as they relate to the 3 C's, our favorite subject: cops, courts, and constitutions. With that said, welcome everybody. Ed, thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Mike.
What's that hat say? Is that an NRA hat? There you go. Do you wear your KKK hat underneath that or over it? I'm just
No. Only the lefties think it's a KKK hat. But you know,
checking.
Funny thing about lefties. Every lefty I've ever known in a situation where their life is being threatened is always looking for the guy with the gun.
Well,
go figure.
On another note, let's talk a little bit about history, because I want the folks to understand how we got to where we are in terms of, people are always complaining, it's not fair, the system's not fair, people aren't treated fair, blah, blah, and everybody's always bitching about how horrible we are. But let's talk about where we came from, right? Before there was an America, before there was a constitution, before there was any rule of law in this country, basically we were subject to what? The king's rule.
King's whims.
Whatever the king decided. He woke up one day and decided he wanted more tax money from his subjects. He got it. He woke up one day and decided he needed a distraction. He hung a bunch of people.
And just to be clear, you could protest. You could absolutely protest.
Yeah, just like you
go and see him one day in the street corner and tell your friend politely, I kind of think what the king is doing is wrong. You had every right to do that, but you'd end up in prison.
Right. I was going to say, it's kind of like, the female broadcaster who just stood up with a sign on Russian television, the producer behind the broadcaster. Yeah, she's free to do what she wants to do. She's just going to rot in prison afterwards.
Right. You're just going to end up in prison.
So where we came from was a place where our founding fathers said, we don't want this. We want to have a free country. We want to have a democratic republic. We want to have a society where the people have a say and where the people have some sense that no matter what they may be accused of, no matter what they may be challenged by, there is going to be mechanisms for fairness so that we're not subject to those whimsical, tyrannical dictates and mandates. And so the first instance of where we see this is probably in the Fifth Amendment, right? Would it be in the Fifth Amendment or would it be in the preamble?
That's a good question.
I think it's in the Fifth Amendment, because in the Fifth Amendment, you have the original due process clause, right? And due process is broken down into 2 categories. We'll get into that in a moment. But the funny thing was that the Constitution, as written originally, only bound the federal government, right? So all of those protections in the first 10 amendments, everything up until up until you start to get past the Civil War, effectively, it only bound the federal government. States were still free to do whatever the hell they wanted. So there was a mandate by the feds pursuant to our federal government, which would be the equivalent of the king, right? It's our version of a king instead of a monarchy.
But be careful using that word, because that's one of the things that would trigger our founding fathers specifically.
Right. Well, again, I'm using it as an analogy. Basically, what they said is we don't want a one-person king. We want a 3-part system of government with checks and balances that serves as a king. Right? So it's not one individual, it's 3 branches working co-equally to form a system that everybody can understand how they're supposed to expected to run their lives and what they can expect if they're accused or challenged or what have you. And it's not until after the Civil War that you start getting the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. And in the 14th Amendment, you have the Equal Protection Clause, right? And what that does is it takes due process that was only applicable to the feds and now says, hey, now, we're making the states, we're holding the state governments to the same standards as the feds. Right. So while that was not enunciated in our original Constitution or the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, it was, or the Bill of Rights rather, it is in subsequent amendments because we needed to kind of pull it all together. Correct. So, look, there was a time where slaves did not count, right? They were not considered people, so the Constitution didn't apply to them. Along came the 13th Amendment and said, well, now it's not so much anymore. And then, of course, you had the same thing with regards to women's rights and civil rights acts and all sorts of other things that have been passed over, decades and decades and decades. Go ahead.
And since the show today's talking about, equal rights and how people are treated or should be treated here in America equally. And I know that everybody says, and it's true. I mean, let's be honest, we cannot. I think it's important, Michael, to mention something about our founding fathers, if some may not realize this. One of the reasons they wanted a checks and balances situation where you had different branches, different groups of people checking the other groups, was because they firmly believed and recognized that man is corruptible. And that was the problem. They figured no matter how fair and just any one man could be right now today, put in a position of power, it's very likely that he would become corrupt because that's human nature. And that's why they did it. And that's going to, I think, hopefully piggyback into what we're talking about today. I am not judging anybody specifically, nor am I saying that we are better than anybody. It is our human nature to do some of the things that Michael and I are going to be talking about that happen to people in the system and how best to deal with it, how to encounter that human nature of the other person that you're dealing with. So just wanted to throw that out there. Keep that in mind as we're talking about the show.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the whole principle, is that our founding fathers had the foresight to understand that one person's rule is tyrannical. And the checks and balances that they created between the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive create a way, at least theoretically, for that not to occur, so that a president doesn't become a monarch, so that a legislature doesn't become a monarch, or so that the courts don't become a monarch. Right. And we hear this no matter which side of the political spectrum you're on. It doesn't matter whether you're, on the left, on the right, in the middle, anywhere along that continuum. The same argument applies and is made by both sides and all people in between, that, you don't want judges writing laws. You don't want Congress passing laws without a check valve by the executive and the court, right? You don't want the executive writing laws by simply, signing their name to an edict, and that's the end of that. Right. So there are checks and balances, and it's a good thing. It's theoretically, anyhow, it's supposed to keep everybody honest. So in terms of the criminal justice system, we worry about equal protection and fairness on many different levels, but let's just go conceptually from the beginning and talk about due process. And what is due process, right? I mean, due process basically is your right to notice and an opportunity to be heard. That's really pretty much, if you want to sum it up in a nice little nutshell, there's a lot more to it than that, because what constitutes notice and what constitutes an opportunity to be heard. But let's just say that those are the two starting points. In other words, you can't just be dragged into a gulag and thrown into a cage or a pit without being told why. Theoretically. Now, of course.
And they're forced to prove it. They have to prove it.
First, you got to start with that premise that you're entitled to know. If they take you in, if the cops are going to smack the cuffs on you, you are entitled to know why.
And can I pause there for a second? Because this happens to you, I'm sure, a lot. My clients will tell me all the time, when they were arresting me, they didn't tell me what I was being arrested for. Well, at that point, they really don't have to, okay? If they tell you, it's probably better for them because it tends to de-escalate things, especially if somebody keeps asking, why are you arresting me? But they don't really need to tell you at that juncture why you're being arrested. They need to tell you at some point, but not while they're cuffing you.
The one that I get all the time that always, both simultaneously makes me cringe and laugh is, and they didn't read me my rights.
I was going to say,
That's
you should have
the
let me
biggie.
guess. I have to
That's-
go, you know, every time I get a client who says that, they get a quick lesson in law school, from law school, our law school lesson on when they have to read you your rights and the Miranda rights and how it actually works. But yeah,
Well, but
happens
it's,
all the
you know,
time.
but the problem is people watch too much television. So, you know, they get their law school degree from, you know, watching, I would say watching like Kojak and The Night Stalker and Starsky and Hutch, but those are
Ooh,
way
the
too intellectual.
Night
Those are
Stalker.
way too intellectual for today's day and age.
You know they show the reruns on Me TV
Oh, I love that
on
show.
cable. You know they have it
Kolchak,
on.
right?
I'll get it to you. I'll get
Kolchak.
it to you.
So
So let's go on
So
with
you're
what's up.
entitled. So you're entitled to notice. In other words, they have to tell you why it is that they're taking you in, and then you're entitled to an opportunity to be heard. That means you're entitled to present a defense. Procedural due process is broken into two categories as a matter of basic law: procedural due process and substantive due process. And the terms are really self-defining. Substantive, substance, right? Procedural, procedure. We primarily concern ourselves in the area of criminal law with procedural due process. That's our big primary concern. Is everybody following the roadmap? Is everyone following the flow chart? Is every box being checked as we go down the list of things that are supposed to have happened? Or was there a failure somewhere, in which case Ed and I, or you know, the defense attorney of your choice, can jump in and try and take advantage of that misstep or miscue by the government? Because the government is required at every step along the way to afford you procedural due process. And where they fail, you're entitled to a remedy. That remedy may be a dismissal of your charges, maybe will, maybe won't. I guess it depends on the nature of the grievance, but it could be. So in any event, we have to try and take advantage of that. And I won't even call that a loophole or a technicality, because it isn't.
No, it's not.
It's fundamental, basic building blocks, ABCs, 1, 2, 3s of criminal defense and criminal procedure.
And it's the foundation of the criminal justice system in this country, Michael, really.
And just to give you an idea, just to give the audience a little bit, even though we're not going to get into it too much, but just so you know, substantive due process is a little bit different. That's more like the rule that the government cannot interfere with certain rights that you have. For example, your right to work or your right to practice a certain religion. It's a different area of due process. Those are more along the lines of the preamble to the Constitution of your inalienable rights, right? You have inalienable rights to be free, to pursue liberty, happiness. That's more on the substantive scale than the procedural scale. So our focus has to stick with procedure more often than not, and equal protection, which is really the fundamental issue that we want to hit here today. If I am arrested for lurking with intent to gawk, and a black man is arrested 6 blocks away for the same offense, theoretically, irrespective of anything between us, we ought to be treated fundamentally, fairly, and equally. Both of us. But are we? Okay? And I'm not trying to make this a race issue, so I'm just using that as an example. The same thing could apply whether it was a man or a woman, whether it's a transgender individual, whether it's based on religion, somebody who's wearing, let's say, Muslim, appears as a Muslim wearing traditional garb. They may be treated differently by an individual police officer.
And let me throw two things in there. Could be two white men, could be two black men, need to be treated the same. Could be somebody with mental health issues, which happens a lot, where they're treated poorly because of the officers, and it's understandable if you've ever had to deal with somebody with a mental health issue. They get frustrated. They get frustrated because they don't know how to deal with it. And then that person is treated fundamentally unfair and not equal.
That just reminded me, I just made a note, that there are some times where we do want to treat people differently. And mental health and veterans are great examples. We have created, and when I say we, I don't mean Ed and I mean our system, has created separate courts, we call them courts, for mental health court and for veterans court and even for drug court. And so what we do is we take these individuals and pull them out of the cattle call that is any normal day calendar and say, wait a minute, you're a veteran. Wait a minute, you have mental health issues. wait a minute, you're an addict who's seeking treatment and wants help. And we treat you differently than we do everybody else in the system based on that individual characteristic that you happen to have that I may not have. So if Ed and I get arrested for the same offense, but Ed's a veteran and I'm not, Ed may be treated very differently than me. And
But
that
down the
is,
road, that would be down the road. On the side of the road, you and I need to be treated exactly the same, and I would have to be
and it
arrested.
should be, and we're going to talk about that because
Correct.
let's take that example.
Correct.
Let's leap forward and take that same exact example. I get arrested for DUI. Ed gets arrested for DUI. Same cop, 3-4 hours apart. We're stopped for the same reason in the same area. There's no extenuating circumstances that make his case different than mine. Neither of us have priors. Both of us are double refusals. Neither of us did roadsides. Neither of us gave breath. And we were both taken into custody. Ed is a Marine vet. I am not. Ed's wearing his USMC hat, and the police officer that arrests him happens to be a veteran. And he says to Ed, hey, by the way, I noticed your hat. Is that, did you serve? And Ed and him start talking. Turns out they were in the same unit, or they knew people in common, or they were discharged with the same rank. You know what? There may be a very big difference between how you and I are treated by that very same police officer.
And it should not be. Should not be. But it happens. And it goes back to what I said earlier, what our founding fathers recognized. We are human. And so as a human,
speak for yourself.
As a human, there's a lot of factors that go into it. One of them is humans tend to want to be around other people that are like them. And I'm not just saying race, right? Notice how if you go to a party, people that have things in common tend to gravitate to each other. Why? Because they like talking to each other. They like being with each other. So when this officer sees a Marine, that he's a Marine, he's already going to feel like he's got some kind of a kinship with me. And it could change the behavior, but it really shouldn't. He should treat Michael as politely as he's probably going to treat me. And he should arrest me exactly like he's going to arrest Michael if I've committed a DUI. So, but it's normal. And this is one of the things that I think I at least wanted to bring to the conversation today is how can you as a citizen, John Q. citizen, when you're put in these scenarios, what is the best way for you to handle these scenarios so that you have a positive outcome or as positive as possible? One of them is you need to understand those basic principles. People are human. Cops are people. They're not robots. The academy doesn't turn them into robots. They're not become better people because they went to the police academy. Some would argue they actually become worse because they went through the police academy. They are human. And so you have to understand where they're coming from. They could have had a bad day, which they shouldn't bring to work, but shit, we all do, right? They could be really stressed out right now. They could be having some personal problems. Again, things they shouldn't bring to work, but everybody does it. And just that when a cop does it, sometimes it can make it a lot worse. So keep those things in mind and understand that if a cop, for example, comes up to you on the side of the road for a traffic ticket and he immediately starts yelling and screaming at you like he's got some kind of a mental issue, number one, he may.
He probably does.
Number one, he may, and he just doesn't, he's not aware of it, or he is and nobody's dealt with it. Or two, he could be having a bad day. And all you're going to do is escalate it by keep yelling at him or making it worse when you're not going to win that on the side of the road. But we'll get to that in a minute. I'm sure Michael's going to cover that.
And the same applies. We're going to have the same discussion when it comes to prosecutors and judges. Correct. And even juries. Because, again, these are all individuals. And so you have to deal with the individual flaws. You got positives and minuses that come with everyone. I mean, apart from Martinez, who's, perfect. Yeah. The rest of us have some flaws. And so we have to acknowledge that. But you do run into those problems. But I want to get back to this concept of equal protection. Because the 14th Amendment, again, that takes the Fifth Amendment's due process clause and applies it to the states, right? And it basically says, nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. Again, it's a fundamental. It's what we want. It's what we strive towards. It's what our founding fathers envisioned, even though look how imperfect they were, because they didn't write the 14th Amendment. They didn't think about it. They never envisioned the states having the power that the states ultimately had. And one only need think about it this way. Virtually all crime in this country, I don't know what the exact split is between federal and state prosecutions, but the overwhelming majority of criminal prosecutions occur in state court.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a vastly larger number of state law violations in criminal court than there are in federal. It's not to say that there aren't a lot of federal, and it's certainly not to minimize the importance or the significance or the severity of a federal prosecution. But it is to say these guys weren't thinking about that back in the 1700s.
No.
It wasn't heavy on their minds.
Right. Well, first it was a republic, so they also were still where we were growing as a nation. So a lot of that had to do with back then, especially the Republicans, wanted the states to be able to govern themselves. So they tried to interfere as little as possible. But obviously, as time goes on, they realize, well, hold on, we do have to interfere sometimes in order to keep this country together. We have to interfere sometimes. So those are where the amendments come up.
And all of those happen post-Civil War. This is like right after the Civil War ends, all of a sudden, states' issues became very important. Obviously. And that's why we start getting all of these different amendments that are coming in at this point in time, which are now broadening constitutional protections beyond just the federal government. So a lot of times you hear, like, for example, let's just say illegal search and seizure, right? Everybody knows that term. But what they don't know is if Ed and I are roommates and we live together, and I decide to break into, and Ed keeps a padlock on his door. When he's not home, he literally padlocks his door so nobody can get in there. And I cut the padlock, kick his door in, take a drill to it, whatever I do. He's not home. I go in and I call the police and say, you guys aren't going to believe what my freaking roommate has in here. Body parts and drugs and, bound up little girls and blah, blah, blah. There's no illegal police action. The Fourth Amendment is completely inapplicable to that. Why? I'm not the government. Now, if I am a confidential source, if I am working, if I am a de facto agent, or if I am a government agent, let's say Ed and I are roommates and I'm a police officer and I find that Ed has this, well, you know what? I'm not acting in my capacity as a private citizen when I have a badge and a gun and a law enforcement certification. I'd better turn this over to someone and let them get a warrant, run it by a judge, and make sure it's cool. But that aside, if we're just basic civilian roommates, there's no Fourth Amendment protection there.
Not for them. But you have committed a crime, though, by breaking into my bedroom.
But that's a separate issue.
I know, but I just don't.
The evidence.
I don't want anybody listening to think they can just break into their roommate's bedroom.
That's true. That's true. Fair point. But my point was more on the side of that the Constitution and these due process concerns are relative to the government and government actors. It's not just limited to cops or corrections officers or even judges and prosecutors, because there are other people, like confidential informants are a great example. Most confidential informants are private citizens that for one reason or another, whether it's because they're working off their own case or whether it's because they always wanted to be a cop but they can't because they got a criminal record, or whether they're being paid, it's just a job, or any of a number of reasons. You have your Dudley Do-Right citizens who just can't wait to turn people in.
And just so that we're clear, any person who does anything at the command of law. So even if you're not a CI, you're just walking in, the cops knock on your door and say, hey, Haber, somebody said something about your roommate Martinez. We want you to open the door. And you're like, hey, I don't know if I should do that. And the cop's like, we don't care. Break it down. Now at that point, they are on the hook and Mike is off the hook because this is under the color of law that they forced Michael to do it. So it's their fault. And now they are on the hook. So it gets a little complicated. But like you said, like we tell you all the time, that's why you hire a good lawyer who can sift through these things and make sure we get to the right outcome, which is always what's best for the Constitution.
And best for the client.
And best for the client.
So I think what Ed said is basically, again, it's the government or anybody working at the behest or at the action or as what we call a de facto government agent. But shy of that, private citizens, there's no constitutional protection. And this is one of the reasons why we have a lot of very interesting litigation in the civil arena on this types of things. So, I mean, again, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but remember back when, not too long ago, there was a baker who refused to bake a cake for a gay wedding. And, I mean, that thing riddled its way all the way up through the court system. because these people wanted this person to make a cake, and this person said, I ain't making your cake. I don't believe in, it's against my religious beliefs, how you guys live your life, and I am not taking a part of it. Well, these are private individuals. And at the end of the day, that's the way this ultimately got shaken out, was the courts came back and said, listen, this is a market question. This is not a constitutional question. You don't have a constitutional right to equal protection from private citizens.
By the way, so that we're accurate on the story, because a lot of the mainstream media left out a huge part of it. He had no problem making them a cake, by the way. He told them he'll make them any cake. They can take any cake they want. They wanted him to write on the cake, God loves gay marriages or something.
Whatever it was. Again, my point, I don't want to get into the specifics of it other than to say that the difference here is these are private individuals. They're not public government agents or employees or agencies. And so the rules are different, and they're necessarily different. This is what we call a capitalist society. So, you let the market set the terms for whether or not this business stays afloat, given the principles that this particular individual wants to employ. But when it comes to cops, we have a totally different ballgame. So what happens if a police officer does that? What happens if a police officer says, well, I was going to cut you some slack on this DUI and let you take a cab home, but you're gay, so I'm taking you in, right? Now imagine that. How would that play out? Or how about, I was going to let you call somebody to pick you up, but I realized you're Jewish, so you know what? Screw you. You're going in. Any type of discrimination, whether it's religious or sexual or racial, it doesn't really matter. You're entitled to equal protection. You're entitled to due process. You're entitled to fundamental fairness. You're entitled to 365 solstices, right? You're entitled to 365 equinoxes, rather. That's what you're entitled to.
Right.
When it comes to the 3 C's,
but like
cops, courts, and constitutions. So your entitlement notwithstanding, let's talk about the real world now. Let's talk about what happens when we leave the world of the academic.
The esoteric world of
and we come back to reality and put our feet back on the sand. Because as Ed said, any given day, any given person wakes up on one side of the bed or the other. We are all human. We all have frailties. We all have biases. We all have prejudices. Whether we want to admit them or not, there is no perfect person. Most of us are able to control those things and to deal with life in a rational manner so that we don't run around pissing people off. But you know what? If you're a Klansman, odds are you're going to be a racist. Odds are you're not going to be a non-racist Klansman. I'm not saying it's impossible because I don't know any Klansmen personally. Maybe there's some out there.
I don't know why you brought that one up because I don't know any Klansmen, and I'm not sure that any of them would not be racist. But
right, well, that's what I'm saying. I'm just giving them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe there's one out there that isn't. But overall, you have to assume that if that's your mentality and that's what you subscribe to, then your prejudice and your bias and your hatred is patent, right? You're not going to be able to separate that. If you're a Klansman and you're put on a jury and you get that generic question from the judge, can you treat this defendant fairly? If you're going to answer it honestly, no, you can't. So we try, at least most modern police departments, if not all, do psychological screening of all applicants, right? Because one of the things they want to do is weed out those types of people. They want to weed out people who have, and I'm not specifying to Klansmen, but people who have prejudices or biases, whatever they may be. It doesn't have to be racial. It could be sexual. It could be
or any other kind of mental health issue. Or any kind of mental health issues, obviously.
You want to try and ferret those people out as much as you can, but you can't always siphon them out. Some are going to get through. And some people, like on juries, we know from our experience, you have people who want to get on that jury. They want it.
They have an agenda.
For whatever reason, some of them, they just want to do their community service and they're honest to goodness, 100% solid citizens. But guess what? A lot of them are not. A lot of them have an agenda. A lot of them want to put somebody in prison, or a lot of them refuse to put somebody in prison. It could go either way. So when you have those types of things, again, where's the fairness? Where's the due process? Where is the solstice? Where does it exist? The equinox, rather. Where does it exist?
You're asking me? Or
I'm just throwing it out there rhetorically.
Yes. Well, let's. I think if we could, if you don't mind, Mike, let's go step by step. So when you're on the side of the road, how can you ensure that your protection is equal? How can you ensure that you are equally protected when you get stopped by a law enforcement officer? And when I say stop, it's the car, it's walking. You're at Walmart and there's a disturbance and the cops show up. I don't know, whatever. It's always the police encounter, right? And like I said earlier, the goal is, as we've been talking, is equal protection, to treat you equally and for them to understand the law. But as we know, not everybody understands the law. Hell, there are judges who get it wrong sometimes. That's why there are appellate courts. So you can't expect a cop to understand the law perfectly. And they're human, right? Even our founding fathers recognized that humans are flawed and they're going to have a bad day. You are not going to win an argument with a police encounter. Let me explain it to you in simpler terms. Never. Not going to happen. You're not going to win. It's not going to happen. I don't know how many videos you have to see of people fighting with cops and they get arrested. And then later you find out, oh, he was right. But he still spent the night in jail and he still had to bond out and he still had to hire a lawyer and he was yelling and screaming. He got thrown to the ground. They twisted his arm. They put a knee on his neck. They balled his legs. They threw him in the backseat of the car. He had to spend the night on a cold concrete floor. For what? If you could be polite, you might actually get out of it. And if you don't, at least, trust me, 99 times out of 100, the cops are going to be gentle with you. They're not going to throw you on the ground.
When you started that little diatribe of yours, I had an image that popped into my mind, and I'm just so upset that I hadn't had the foresight to send it to Andres to play. But you know that Adam Sandler movie, Grown Ups 2, the second one, where they're in the school bus and they're trying to rush off to the school to go see the kids' performance with the dancer, and they can't. They're worried about getting there, and he says, "We'll give you a police escort." And he's like, "You can't do that." What about that? He goes, "I am the law," right?
That's what they are.
If you wind up with the wrong, we talk about the 3 C's, right? I've talked about this before also, the 3 wrongs, the convergence of the 3 wrongs, being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong cop. Well, you might want to add in and make a 4th wrong, saying or doing the wrong thing, right?
But you have every right to. You have every right to. Listen, and here's what I tell my clients when they say, but then I have a right to say that. Well, yes, I also have a right to tell my wife that she looks fat in that dress. I would advise it. Right. But you have a right to do it.
So you have to exercise your own good judgment. But the reality is this. You have to know going into any situation that things are fluid. It really doesn't matter what it is, right? I mean, You could go to a restaurant, your favorite restaurant, and you're prepared to order your favorite meal, but they're out of it. They don't have it. Then what? Do you throw a hissy fit or do you order something else, right? You got to be able to roll with the punches a little bit.
You would throw a hissy fit, admit it.
Oh, I would absolutely throw a hissy fit, but I'm a very finicky eater. But that said, I mean, same thing with the police. Very rarely do you want to tee off on a cop. I mean, look, I've been guilty of being a wise guy with police officers before. It never works out well. It's not a good thing. It may make you feel good in the moment because you got it off your chest, but you're going to wind up with a whole different set of problems that you didn't anticipate. And so, sometimes we have to take the high road and be a little bit more mature about how we deal with things and say, as I guess a basic cost benefit analysis, right? Is it worth it?
Plus, you've got a solution. The side of the road with the officer is not the end of the story. That's only chapter 1.
That's not the arena.
That's just chapter 1.
So we look at a given criminal case, and it doesn't really matter whether it's a misdemeanor or a murder case, because when a client hires either of us, the way that we view the case is it is that particular client's first-degree murder, right? I mean, even a misdemeanor can ruin somebody's life. It can
unless of course they've committed murder before, and then they might see a misdemeanor as something not that important.
Well, they can look at it however they want, but we know how we look at it. So, I mean, I have the vast majority, maybe not, a good portion of my clients, I don't want to exaggerate, but a good portion of my clients undervalue and understate the severity of their own case.
True.
They don't think it's as serious as it is, but I know that 7, 10, 15 years down the road, this stupid little pimple is going to wind up being a mountain for them. And they're going to have to deal with it and explain it. It's going to wind up costing them in many ways that they didn't think. So we have to treat it very differently than they do.
But I guess what we're getting at is the checks and balances are in place, which is really what we wanted to talk about. We're 35 minutes in. So you get arrested for whatever reason, whether it was fair. And again, let's say it wasn't fair. Let's say this officer was having a bad day, because they do. Obviously, there are officers out there.
Well, and hang on, even it can go beyond a bad day. Let's say they get it wrong for another reason, right? Let's take a really typical scenario. And I just want to say one thing before I do that. I want to say what we do, the way that we view this, we view that roadside encounter or that initial police citizen encounter, wherever it happens to happen, that is the initial salvo that starts the war.
Correct.
The war is a long way away from being won or lost, and there will be many battles. There will likely be many battles along the way before there is an ultimate armistice. But at the end, the war will be over, and there will be a winner and there will be a loser. And if you want to maximize your odds at being the winner, shut up, do what I always say, up X2, shut up and lawyer up, and realize that the time, the place, and the person to levy the battle is elsewhere, your lawyer, and in a courtroom, right?
But that said, as we keep going along, you'll see why I'm telling you it's extremely important for Michael and I to help you. It's extremely important for you to be controlled, extremely polite, and non-combative. And it'll come back in a minute. Just remember that. Control your temper, be extremely polite and non-combative, and it will end up ultimately helping Michael and I help you. You'll see as we talk along.
Let's take an example of a really common example of a domestic violence case.
Right.
Police get dispatched to a domestic violence. They show up and there's a couple. I don't care if it's a same gender couple or a heterosexual couple, doesn't matter. There's two people. Neither of them have any physical injuries. There's no physical corroboration, but one of them says X, the other says Y, and the officer is now charged with, what do I do here? I have to believe one or the other, neither or both, and I have to decide whether or not to make an arrest or not. How does that calculus go down? Where is the fundamental fairness in this calculus? Let's say that let's say it's a same-sex situation and the officer has a bias or prejudice against homosexuality. Let's say that it's a heterosexual couple and the officer has a problem with one sex versus the other. Let's say that the officer grew up in an abusive household and had an abusive father or an abusive mother. All of those types of things are going to be going through that cop's mind when they shouldn't. They have no place there.
Right.
This should be a fair, equal judgment call based on the facts and circumstances, but you cannot separate the human experience, bias, and prejudice from the individual. You never can. And the first step, just kind of like with AA, is admitting that you have a problem, right? Admitting that you grew up in that type of an environment, that you were exposed to that as a child, that it's affected you. And knowing that that exists allows you the ability to hopefully deal with it more intelligently,
right,
as opposed to emotionally.
Right, but we're relying on the officer to understand that and come to see somebody about that. But he might not. He may not even realize, right? Yep. To talk about in terms of
a lot of that is unconscious and
the implicit bias, right? Here is implicit bias. He may not realize that he has a problem. Let's take a real world scenario on a very good cop who's really trying to do the right thing and treat everybody equally. Let's say he grew up in a home where his father was a little bit abusive, and when his father got abusive, he got a little loud and a little bit insulting. Okay, he shows up and there's two gay men. He doesn't know what to do, but he's got to make a decision based on probable cause, meaning after he looks at all the evidence, what's more probable than not as to what occurred, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the two combatants, one of these two gay men, starts getting loud and aggressive and cursing. This officer may not even realize that that's triggering him, and he instinctively is going to say, well, this guy must have been the one who did it because he sounds just like my father who used to beat my mother. So even in a best case scenario, the officer may do something that doesn't treat people equally and fairly, but it's not because of anything he's doing intentionally. It's not because he hates gays. It's not because of any of that. It just, he himself may not realize why he, in his mind, thought, this is what I'm going to do. And then he goes and treats that person unfairly. Why? Let's say perhaps he has a real big issue with his father, right? And all those years that his father used to beat his mother, he wanted to beat the shit out of his dad. Well, guess what, buddy? You just triggered him into treating you and seeing you as his father. So you're going to be handled very roughly when, once again, you're not going to win that on the side of the road, right? Unless there's a body-worn camera where you are being very, very polite and you're not getting in his face. And when he says, well, listen, sir, I'm going to have to arrest you, you don't resist. If you do anything different than that, nothing's going to happen to that cop, because you cannot resist an officer with violence, even if he's making a wrongful arrest. Hear me out, right? Another thing that happens, right, Mike? Even if an officer is making a wrongful arrest, let's say Michael and I I'm at Michael's house, and then Michael's neighbors are two gay men. And one of the neighbors calls about a domestic violence disturbance, and the guy confuses Michael and I for the two gay men that had a domestic violence argument. And he goes and tries to arrest one of us. I cannot resist with violence. You can't.
There's only one exception to that rule, and I've been.
I don't even know if I want to mention it, Mike.
I've taken a lot of heat. I've taken a lot of heat for that, because I have one of my video FAQs on my YouTube channel deals with that exact topic. Am I allowed to use force for an unlawful arrest? And you're correct. The answer is absolutely not. But here's the exception. You are permitted to engage in self-defense, in lawful self-defense, if an officer is exceeding their mandate in terms of their use of force.
And that's why I don't like bringing it up.
This is such a horrible line to be drawing. And I always tell people, because you know what happens is, and the reason I catch a lot of heat on it is because you get a lot of these folks, these, people who are, all indignant and righteously indignant. Well, you can't tell me that, you're wrong, and I can defend myself, and I don't care if they're a cop or not. Well, yeah, except what's going to happen is 17 cops are going to beat you into submission, right? And then they're all going to coordinate their stories together so that they can prove that the reason that they all did it was because you were so dangerous and violent, and they had to subdue you one way or another. And at the end of the day, whether you win or not, you lose. So it's just such a bad place to be. Nobody
That's why
wants
I don't even like mentioning it, because
nobody wants to take a
rare. It's so rare.
Nobody wants to take a beating, but it reminds me of that famous line from Goodfellas.
I don't know. I heard a lawyer recently in court in his closing argument say, "Come on, what's the big deal? It's just a little beating." But
well, Henry Hill has that famous line in Goodfellas where he says, "The way I saw it, every now and then everybody has to take a beating." When he was talking about his dad throwing him, an ass kicking. Right. So, look, we don't want to go there, and I think 99.9%. Now, this may not have been true 20 years ago, but today, 99.9% of the cops don't want to go there either, because they know whether they have body cam or not, everybody else has cameras, and nobody wants to wind up in a Derek Chauvin situation. So every cop on the planet, well, every cop here, I don't know about on the planet, every cop here, believe me, they got that in the back of their mind. They don't want to. The last thing that the cops want is to be sitting in a defendant's chair in a criminal trial with them accused.
And look at the most extreme situation, the situation where marked patrolmen pull up on an unmarked officer and start firing. The unmarked officer will not fire back. The unmarked officer will figure out a way to let them know he's a cop so that they won't fight. He's not going to fire back. And that's a situation where you could be killed, and he's a cop. So he's clearly not doing anything wrong. Let's assume he's in his lawful duties, doing a undercover drug buy, and some citizen, John Q. citizen, reports it, and cops show up and just start blasting everybody. Believe me, guys, when I tell you, don't try to push the exception. It's so far and few between that I really have never, in my 20-something years, I've never seen a situation where somebody could have legally fought the officer back and they were justified.
Yeah, there's no good ending to any of that. Now, look, by the same token, again,
just let him cuff you. Thank you.
Here's the tough thing. Okay, it's really difficult for a lot of people to wrap their brain around the fact that they are getting cuffed and stuffed. It is an uncomfortable, perhaps the most uncomfortable feeling that you can imagine. There's nothing good about it. And you know that that's only the beginning, right? Because once they cuff you and stuff you into the patrol car, then you got to worry about how long am I going to be stuck in the patrol car? Under what conditions are they going to keep me in the patrol car, right? I mean, let's say you get arrested in Buffalo, New York in February. They're going to keep you in the patrol car with the windows down for 3 or 4 hours while they just sit there and chat and do paperwork and take their time. Or if you get arrested here in August in Miami, are they going to keep you in the backseat of that police car with the engine off and the windows up for 2 or 3 hours while they sit there and do their paperwork? Or are they going to transport you right away? These are the types of things that the cops can do. It's not right or wrong. I mean, it is wrong, but it's not a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of they can do it. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. And if a cop does do that, that's not going to get your case thrown out, even if the police officer went in there and admitted it, which they never would, because they'd have 16 explanations as to why they had to be there on the roadside for that amount of time. And they'd have 3 or 4 other officers that backed them up and gave them some credibility with that. But either way, the point is it's largely within your control. As Ed said, the less resistance that you give, the more cooperative that you are. And I'm not suggesting that anybody needs to just, say, okay, here you go, take me away, let's go. Let's have a good time. But you don't do the opposite, right? You don't become obstructionist. You definitely don't become violent. And you don't start lecturing the police officers on your rights because they don't give a shit about your rights. That's not their job.
Right. And here's the only thing I would say, I should always suggest start off with, I respect law enforcement tremendously. Right? When you start talking and tell them your side, that's a good thing to try and start
Right,
off.
Except for you half a wussy with those little woman arms inside that shirt. I mean, come on. Do you ever go to the gym?
So, but let's look at the checks and balances. So now let's say the officer went overboard. Let's say he did something bad, whether it was because he's a racist, he's a jerk, or he's having a bad day, or he just didn't realize what he was doing was wrong. It doesn't matter. Now, you've only been arrested. And this is something else I have to tell my clients. I'm sure you do too, Michael. When you are arrested, that does not mean you have been charged. The charge comes from the prosecutor. So all the arrest says is there was a guy who took an oath as law enforcement who believes that it was more probable than not that you committed this crime. Now it's got to go to the prosecutor. Most prosecutors understand that their role is as a gatekeeper to make sure that nothing gets charged, because this is the oath that prosecutors took. I took it. Every prosecutor has taken it. Ethically, a prosecutor should not file charges on a case that they don't believe they can prove beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt. So there's the second check. If they're doing it, and again, prosecutors are human, guys. They could make a mistake. They could be in a bad mood. They could be prejudiced. You name it. It could happen.
They could be stupid.
They could be stupid. Okay. Or their boss could be stupid, because at some state attorneys like this one and others, sometimes you have to get approval. So when I was there, sometimes I would go and say, listen, I don't think that this is right. I don't think we should charge this guy. I think there was enough for probable cause, but it didn't come. We don't have enough evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And my chief might tell me, well, I don't care. File it anyway. Now, you would have to, as a prosecutor, have the testicular fortitude, which some of us may have had, to say, well, then you file it, because I'm not doing it. And that's what I used to do. But I understand that not everybody's like me, right? I used to say, no. I took an oath. If you think that this can be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, here's the file. You can file it, or you can give it to another prosecutor. But I will not do it, because I took an oath.
And that's how it should be.
But I also understand, Mike, that some younger prosecutors, like to fly under the radar, or they think that their boss knows more than they do. They think they're going to get fired. There's all kinds of reasons. Yeah. But at the end of the day, this is how the system is supposed to work, so right? The prosecutor is the next check.
So that running with that, as we talked about earlier in the show, when we talk about due process and we talk about equal protection and we talk about the 3 branches of government and the checks and balances that they each have on each other as a way to avoid that tyrannical monarchical type of dictatorial rule, the same thing applies to the criminal justice system. You've got a cop, you've got a prosecutor serving as a check valve, or supposedly. You've got a judge supposedly serving as a check valve to the prosecutor.
Right.
And then you've got an appellate judge supposedly serving as a check valve to the judge.
And
you've got a jury, and you've got a jury that serves as a check valve to everybody.
So let's go back to the prosecutor scenario, because I missed one other scenario that it's fair, it has to be put out there. Perhaps the prosecutor does believe that they can prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. They may do. They may think, well, it's not a great case, but I can prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, it may be that they're right. It may be that they have delusions of grandeur. Whatever the reason is, they may legitimately, honestly believe that they can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So where's the check valve now? Mike just mentioned it. We have a judge, right? Mike, we can file motions, right? We talked a few of them last week. We can file some motions. We can take some depots and file some motions to see if the judge can get involved and say, wait a minute, Mr. Prosecutor, Miss Prosecutor, I know you think you can prove this beyond a reasonable doubt, but I'm not even letting this get to a jury because this would be a travesty of justice. There is not just simply not enough. So I'm granting the motion to dismiss. Stand your ground motions, motions to dismiss, motions to suppress evidence because they were procedurally obtained illegally. Yes.
We're gonna and by the way, folks, we're gonna do a show just on motions to suppress.
Right.
Because that's a topic in and of itself, and that's right. in the pipeline.
Yes, there was a dead body in your freezer in the garage. However, the officers obtained that information and that evidence illegally. And so, because in the infamous words of, I believe it was Benjamin Franklin, there's some people who dispute this, he said that our criminal justice system, this is the best way we can boil down to what's fair and equal. It is better that one guilty man go free than 100 innocent men be convicted. So when we file a motion to suppress because they found a dead body in the garage in a freezer that was obtained illegally, Michael and I are not doing it to get that guy off. We're doing it for all the other people who they might frame him with a dead body. It may not be his garage. There could have been somebody else in there. They just didn't do it the right way.
As a teaser, the legal concept is called the exclusionary rule, and what it means is that the court is obliged to exclude illegally obtained or unconstitutionally obtained evidence. Right. So the point is not to say that this individual is innocent and therefore you can't go after him. The point is to punish the police, to punish law enforcement, to send a message to them that says, we want you to do your job, but you got to play by the rules, even if the other guys don't.
It's to send a message that there are check valves. It's just what we're talking about. It lets them know, don't screw up, because I'm sitting here to make sure you don't.
We all love, at least old folks like Ed and I, love Dirty Harry, right? We love those types of cop shows where you have the badass cop that just, he does what he does and he doesn't give a crap, doesn't really care about the consequence. He's just out there doing his thing. The point is to stop that type of behavior. And so it's great for the movies. It's great for the box office. It's great fun to lay in bed and watch. But you don't want Dirty Harry coming after you. They call him Dirty Harry for a reason, right?
Well, for example, notice that Dirty Harry never, ever once in his 20-year career, as crazy and brazen and wild as he was with shooting off his .44 Magnum, never once did he shoot the wrong person. That's not reality. Right. Especially with a .44, a bunch of those bullets would have gone through that guy and killed somebody behind him.
But even in the first movie, where he violates the villain's rights and the protagonist's rights and the antagonist's rights, rather, and the case winds up getting dismissed and the guy goes back out on the street, this is the point. The point is law enforcement needs to know that their mandate is to protect society. And if they fail in following the rules, then they're actually not protecting society because they're putting guilty people back out on the streets.
So, Mike, let's go back so they can understand what we're talking about. Why is it that Michael and I are telling you, stay calm? Let's go back to the scenario that one of the scenarios. The two gay couple next door, two gay men are getting into domestic violence. Another citizen neighbor calls. The cops show up, and they tell me and Michael, we got to call domestic violence. Now, Michael and I are going to be looking at each other saying, first of all, I don't know what you're talking about. This is not domestic violence. I just came over to hang out with Mike. He's not my boyfriend. I don't know what you're talking about. We were watching a movie. And they're going to say, no, 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 no. Michael has a bruise on his arm. Well, Michael was working out the other day and he bumped into something. He said, I didn't do that. Well, sorry, we're taking you in. Okay. I'm telling you, I don't know what you're talking about. But okay. Just don't fight. Then what happens? It gets to the prosecutor. Well, I'll hire a lawyer.
How about let me throw a monkey wrench in your machinery. While you're trying to do that, I'm interfering and saying, no, this is all bullshit. He didn't do any of that. Now all of a sudden I get popped for obstruction.
Right. And then we got to call a prosecutor. We both have to hire lawyers. And hopefully our lawyer, if you hire us early enough in the process, we'll talk to the prosecutor and say, dude, listen, these guys are not gay. Not that it has anything to do with it. But the 911 call said specifically it was two gay men that are her neighbor. The neighbor knows who they are and knows where the guy's fighting. Have you spoken to the victim? Ask the victim. Show him my guy's face. Show him my client's face, because this is not the guy. And maybe the prosecutor finds out that, in fact, we was wrong. The case gets no action, right? No further arrest, no resisting with violence, which suppose that I had fought back, right? Now, Michael can't get rid of his obstruction of justice, and I can't get rid of my resisting with violence. They're going to drop the battery charge, but Michael is still on the hook for obstruction of justice, and I'm still on the hook for resisting with violence.
And those are what we call gratuitous charges. So,
right. So stay calm.
So police officers have a lot of discretion. And so let's say that you get pulled over for speeding, right? I mean, let's take criminal out of it. Let's just go to talk about infractions. You get pulled over for speeding. And the police officer walks up and the first words out of your mouth are, all right, you prick. What are you doing? You start cursing the guy out, telling him blah, 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 and what's wrong with you? And I was going the speed limit, or everybody else was going the same limit. Why'd you single out me? There were people going faster than you know what? You're probably going to wind up with a hell of a lot more than a speeding ticket. And even at a minimum, if you get that speeding ticket, that officer will definitely be notating on the back of his copy of the citation, this guy was a Class A asshole.
Oh, yeah.
Do not cut him any slack. And when it comes time for court, unless you pay the ticket and need the points or go to driving school if you're eligible, that cop is going to absolutely bury you in front of the judge.
It actually happened to me. I had a dear friend of mine who got stopped for running a stop sign. And I always ask my traffic clients this, because I don't do a lot of traffic, Mike, but you know how friends and family are. They'll always call us to handle a traffic ticket. And I was doing her a favor. I know. No good deed goes unpunished. First question I asked all my friends, were you polite? She said, absolutely. I said, really? Okay. All right. Showed up to court thinking, okay, this is going to be easy. This is going to be a withhold court cost. She probably ran the red stop sign. There's no way to prove was it. We called the case up. Actually, I went over to the officer first, right? We do that, Mike. We go talk to him before the case gets called up. I said, hey, I'm here representing so-and-so. I just want to see how she was. She tells me she was polite. He says, polite? And he pulls out the citation. He had written a novel on the back of the citation. I won't bore you with the details. We don't have a lot of time. Just suffice it to say that the last thing that she said, the coup de grace, this is why you guys get shot. For a traffic ticket, she told this officer, this is why you guys get shot. So, and of course, one of her arguments was, I live near here. Everybody runs a stop sign here. Why are you giving me the ticket? That's not going to fly. And telling a cop, this is why you get shot over a traffic ticket. Believe me, he tried to find stuff on her. She just couldn't. And at that point, what am I going to do? There's nothing I can do to help her because this cop is not going to let it go. To be honest with you, I got her a withhold court cost anyway. I don't know how I did that.
When it comes to crimes cases, it's worse because you wind up not only facing the original charge, whether it's a domestic violence battery or a lewd and lascivious or who knows, it doesn't matter what it is. Your actions in large part will dictate how the officer treats you. And those gratuitous charges come on. Next thing you know, you get charged with resisting arrest. If you're not lucky, you get charged with resisting arrest with violence. If you're not lucky, you get charged with battery on a law enforcement officer.
And the point is this, Michael, and then these checks and balances are irrelevant now. Because I really did commit a battery resisting.
But even if you didn't, and even if the officer makes it up, unless there's tangible proof, sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes there's video, sometimes there isn't.
Especially now there's the body cam. So let's say that the officer says...
But not always, right? There are some agencies like Coral Gables doesn't have body cam. Can you imagine the entire city of Coral Gables, there ain't one body cam or dash cam?
Right. Well,
The
and
city of
sometimes
Sunny Isles Beach, not
let's
one
say
body cam or dash cam.
let's say later on in the situation you commit a resisting. They claim you commit a resisting with violence, but if they do have a body cam or any kind of video of the initial encounter, and initially you're speaking to them the way I'm speaking now, calmly, controlled, polite, it's much easier for Michael and I to go to a prosecutor and say, dude, seriously, you think this is the guy that all of a sudden turned around and tried to fight the cop? Whereas if the minute he shows up, you do like Michael says, hey, get out of here, you pig. I don't need you. I don't need to tell you nothing. Get off my property. Get the hell. Now, when the cop says, well, I know the camera malfunctioned 20 minutes later, but trust me, they're going to believe it. So we have these checks and balances. Maybe the prosecutor. Now, let's say the prosecutor says, well, listen, Ed, or to his lawyer, your client, maybe he didn't do that, but dude, he resisted with violence. And the other guy definitely obstructed with justice. I got to charge those guys. We still have more checks and balances, right? We can go to the judge. We can take depositions of the victims and the cops. And then maybe we can file some type of a motion to suppress. We might be able to find something in there where we can show that maybe I didn't commit a resisting with violence, but it was actually without violence. And that one I might be able to get taken care of. Maybe I can show that Michael, under these circumstances, to a judge, I can say, under these circumstances, he wasn't obstructing justice. He was actually trying to do justice. He was trying to explain to these officers, this is not the guy. So we might be able to do that. But let's say the judge says, nope, still ain't buying it. We can go to the court of public opinion. You're impartial, not a jury of your peers. It's not what the law says. So please stop telling us that when we come to hire us. It's not a jury of your peers. That would be way too difficult and almost impossible. It is an impartial jury. You're entitled to an impartial jury. So Michael and I try to pick what we think is an impartial jury, and then we plead the case to them. So you have all these checks and balances. There's no reason for you to think you're going to do it on your own, standing on the side of the road. It's not going to happen. When you're on the side of the road with the officers, let me tell you what your odds are. Your odds are worse than what they had at the Alamo. And we know how that turned out. So it's not going to fly. You are going down.
Let me sum all this up real quick, tying it back together with our initial opening, which dealt with the equinox. Equinox, equal protection, fairness, fundamental, due process, procedural. These are our ideals. Are we perfect? No. Are all of the players perfect? No. Are all of the rules perfect? No. That's why it consistently evolves. That's why when the Constitution was written, it was written as it was written, and it has been amended since. That's why it has been interpreted since. The check valves and the checks and balances that exist in terms of government and exist in terms of the criminal justice system are there with the ideal for equality. And it's what we all want. We want everybody to be treated fairly. We want everybody to be treated equally. We don't want rich people to get a pass. We don't want movie stars or celebrities to get a pass. We want everybody to be treated equally. So with that in mind, enjoy your March equinox. Enjoy the vernal equinox. The days are only going to get a little bit longer from here. And we're going to work our way towards a solstice soon enough. But in Miami, it's just going to get hotter by the day. So be prepared. You don't want to be sitting in the back of that squad car any longer than you absolutely have to, if you have to. And you do get to some extent, control your own fate, at least in terms of how you will be treated by law enforcement based upon how you treat them.
And one last thing, Michael, by the way, because I just thought of this. If you get that jerk-off cop, don't worry. He will get his. Not from you, because you are, again, in the Alamo. No. When Sam Houston shows up, Michael and I, with an army, he's going to get his. But let us do it for you, because you're not going to win that battle, guys. I'm not saying they're fair. I'm not saying they're all great cops. They're not. I have a lot of friends who know.
And remember, again, like Ed said, it's a battle. It's only the beginning salvo. It's the very start.
Yeah.
There's a whole war to deal with. Let your lawyer be your general. Let your lawyer employ and designate and improvise and make the plan and make it work out, because that's your best case scenario. That said, I want to thank everybody for your time today. Ed, thank you for your
Thank
time.
you, my friend.
Andres, thank you for your production expertise. And we will see you hopefully next week. What's next week? The 28th.
Yeah.
For episode number 36.
Yeah, if I'm not in trial, because once again, I have 2 cases set for trial, but hopefully they're not going.
Well, we'll
Hopefully
see.
we can plead it out.
All right, guys. Have a wonderful day. Thank you very much. Take care, y'all.
Bye-bye.